Hey guys, it's Coach Herb. Just want to go over the notes for you today in case you were not at school or in case you were absent due to health reasons. And so today we're going to get to talk about the Central European monarchs of Austria and Prussia, along with the French monarch, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch during the age of absolute monarchs. So again, we're talking about absolute monarchs, monarchs that have all power and that are controlling of all aspects of society. They could have gained their power through the idea of divine right, which would have mean they would have gotten their power from God, or hereditary power passed down from the king or queen before them, which would have been their parents. And so we talked about some last week and what this idea was, and we're going to continue. And really, the idea that we're focusing on is the idea that each of these monarchs show the characteristics of an absolute monarch. They're examples of it. So told you what an absolute monarch was and why they came about, and now we're seeing the issues in each of these countries that brought an absolute monarch about and how they demonstrated their absolute power. And so in Austria and Prussia, it took not much longer to develop than in Western Europe. Uh, they dealt with a lot of warfare and religious turmoil during their this time frame, 1500 to 1800. Remember the Reformation started there, so it took a lot longer to develop. They had a true 30 years war from 1618 to 1648. Over 4 million people died. The population decreased from 20 million to 16 million. The economics were totally disrupted. Their agriculture was totally destroyed, and so they had to rebuild after the 30 Years' War. And this took them a lot longer to develop. Serfs, they still have serfdom in Central Europe, and that means that peasants were tied to the land of nobles, and they had to work the land, and they couldn't move from city to city. So this hurt their economics as well. 30 Year War had some good results. It did bring about the modern state system of how we actually develop peace treaties and communications between nations. We now talk and have diplomatic issues resolved because of this. And so that's something that's good. And it did shift power away from the Holy Roman Empire to other parts of Europe, specifically France. We'll see France gained a lot of power during this time. So that's kind of the backstory to Central Europe. But let's get into some of their monarchs. The first one that we're going to talk about is Maria Theresa. And she was the Austrian queen in 1740. She becomes the queen through inherited power. Her father, Charles VI, had to arm twist and make alliances because most queens are not recognized as the ruler. Kings are more recognized. And so he made it so that she would be recognized as the absolute power in Austria. And she inherited a very vast empire, very diverse, many different dialects of languages, many different religions, very different in terms of ethnicity of people. And so because of that, the only way that they were truly going to be ruled was through an absolute monarch, somebody making all the decisions. All the controls had to be through one person because it might have been chaos to try to cater to all these different people. Secondly, she built a large standing army to support her authority. And so this large standing army was also there to protect from potential warfare, such as the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War had taught them that they needed to protect themselves. What they really did, instead of controlling the nobility, they created a new nobility class instead of using the old one. And so they promoted these people to nobility status if they pledged loyalty to the queen. And so in doing so, she weakened the power of the nobility by creating a new nobility that was loyal to her. Secondly, she limited the amount of labor that nobles could demand of their peasants. And so the peasants, of course, loved this because they didn't have to work as much. And it controlled the nobility even further because they couldn't do as much economically through the peasants that worked for them. And even though he had set it up so that she would never have to deal with problems, she had to deal with a lot of problems. Her reign was full of conflict. The War of Austrian Succession was fought over a small area of land in between Austria and Prussia, and eventually, her and her allies were defeated by Prussia and their allies. And then, of course, the 7 Years' War, which was the larger part of the French and Indian War. And so this conflict caused her to lose a lot of people because it was such a massive global war. And so both of these issues really cause a lot of problems for her, in their alliances. And so it didn't cause really a territorial change, the 7 Years' War did, but it just caused her to lose a lot of people. And so Maria Theresa was more of what we would call an enlightened despot, in that she was a little bit more liberal. And of course, this is near the end of the age of absolutism. So the absolute power that she had was a little different than what Philip II would have had, and what we'll see with Louis XIV in France. So she was more liked by her people because she allowed some freedoms that maybe some of the other ones did. The second guy we're going to talk about, or the second absolute monarch we're going to talk about, is Frederick the Great. He becomes the king of Prussia in 1740, as well as just like the Queen of Austria. But basically it came about because of crisis. Just like in Austria, crisis in the 30 Years' War and all these pushed people to have a strong central ruler. And so he inherited this from his father, and his father was very militaristic. And he actually didn't think Frederick the Great was going to be a very good ruler. He didn't think he was military enough to rule. And so the prince loved music. He loved philosophy and poetry. And in 1730, he tried to run away with his best friend, but they were caught. And so to punish him and teach him a lesson, his father made him watch his friend be beheaded. Despite these bitter memories, he became Frederick the Great and followed his father's backgrounds of military power. He created a large standing army to protect from the issues of the 30 Years' War. And it would be one of the best fighting forces in the European area, with 80,000 men. And to pay for it, he instituted taxes, permanent taxes on the people. They would also weaken the National Assembly. So he created a way to control the lawmaking process in the country. The national assemblies would have less power, and so he could make his own laws. And the nobles were controlled through bribery. These Junkers, as they would be called, they wanted to be a part of the military, so he commissioned them as officers in return for their allegiance to him. And so they were commissioned as officers, and this rigidly controlled, highly militarized society was under the control of Frederick the Great. He continued to enforce the military policies, but unlike his father, he softened laws on religion and legal reform. So he was more like Maria Theresa, where he was more of an enlightened despot in that he gave in to some of these people. He felt that leaders should be like fathers to their country or to their people, the last refuge of the unfortunate, meaning like he wanted people to come to him for help. Victory in the War of Austrian Succession is kind of his major crowning achievement, and makes Prussia a major European power that we'll hear more and more about as we go forward. But again, you have an example of an absolute monarch through Frederick the Great. So the next guy we're going to talk about is Louis XIV, and you can see this guy. He's got high heels on. He was a short guy. He was about 5'8". He wanted to look taller. He does wear tights. He's very ornately dressed, and that was the style of this French absolute monarch. He was the Bourbon king in 1661 of France, but he was called the Sun King. And he was called the Sun King because the sun gives life and radiates all things for the world. And that's how he was for France. Everything of France radiated from him. He gave life to France, and that's how he kind of portrayed himself. He inherited the throne at 4 years old when I believe his father passed away. Yes, his father passes away, and he inherits the throne. Of course, he can't rule at 4 years old. So the true ruler was Cardinal Mazarin, and he kind of came to power at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. And so he really ruled for Louis the 14th until he was old enough to rule. But constant fighting leads people wanting a strong leader. The 30 Years' War, riots over religion, all these issues cause people to want a strong ruler. What they said was that oppression from a strong ruler would be better than riots and chaos. And so they started to push for a strong ruler. And sometimes you get what you ask for. So riots made Louis really fear the nobles. Attempt on his life. You know, he forgot his fear for the nobles, and it turned to anger eventually. And the nobles who threatened the young king's life, they would regret that decision. And he takes control of the kingdom at the age of 22 years old. And so, in 1643, he gains the control of the kingdom, but in 1661, he takes control. And so he is the sole leader, and that's when Cardinal Mazarin had died. Here is where he really starts changing things. So how did he show his absolute power? Well, first thing he does is he claims, I am the state. And he believed that he and the state were one. He was France. Everything that was France came from him. Everything that France should be like was like him. And so he claimed he was the state. Very boastful about this. Secondly, he weakened the nobility with intendants. Intendants were basically government officials, government agents who collected taxes, administered justice. And, he made sure the local officials communicated regularly with him. So they did what he asked them to do. And the nobles didn't really have a say in it. One of the stories is that the nobles had to use their pinky finger and scratch on the door of where King Louis stayed to get his attention. And they weren't let in until he said so. They were forced to stay at the palace as well. So the nobles were forced to live in the palace instead of staying at their home, and he could control them more there. And the story that I told today in class was that the nobles were there to help him get dressed and just to gain his favor. And he noticed if you weren't there, and he would even mention not knowing some of these nobles if they were not doing what he asked them to do. So every part of their life was about making his life better. He cancels the Edict of Nantes, something that had been set up by his grandfather. And he canceled that in 1685, which ended religious tolerance and protected the religious freedom of the Calvinist Huguenots in France. And most of them left, and it caused a lot of many skilled workers to leave France. And then lastly, to glorify his reign, he builds the Palace of Versailles, which was supposed to be a small or little hunting lodge on this swampy piece of ground. But you'll see here, it turns into much more than that. You have 2,300 rooms in the Palace of Versailles, 5,500 square feet, 6,000 paintings, and 2,000 sculptures. So a very, very, very large complex would be his palace. The small hunting lodge turned into much more than that. Here you have the Hall of Mirrors, 200 feet long with 17 mirrors on the right side of the screen, windows on the left that reflected the beautiful gardens of the Palace of Versailles. And it was symbolic of what Louis said, that he was the state, that he represented France. And in this, you have the reflection of France in the room, very ornate, very unique, and very boastful. The king's bedroom, as you can see, very delicate and ornate and unique in its own right. There's where he would wait for nobles to put his slippers on and his sleeves on for him each morning. Here in the queen's bedroom, it's very similar. It's lined all in gold. And who has that many chandeliers in their room, right? This is the royal chapel. This is where their religious services would have been conducted, and you can see the Greek and Roman architecture here with the columns and the archways, and just going back to all of the traditional values that were instituted in Roman Catholicism. And here's the gardens, and just part of the gardens. There were 5,000 acres of lawns, gardens, and forests and woods on the Palace of Versailles property, 1,400 fountains, and so many fountains that they could only run them all on special occasions. They used so much water that when he would walk through the palace gardens, they would only turn the fountains on that he was nearby, and then turn them off as he left that area, and then turn the next ones on because they used so much water. So how does this man that has all this power and money lose power? Well, he came to power because of religious problems and chaos and wars, and he's going to lose power the same way because many people just grow tired of it. He fought many wars to expand his borders in the 1600s, wars that would gain him small areas, but not just anything major. He would gain towns. He fought additional wars, but really he never gained just a ton of land in this time. Because warfare weakens France, because they really hadn't won very much, and people just grew tired of it. And taxes from paying for the wars and just a series of bad harvests brought suffering to the French people. The War of Spanish Succession didn't help either. This was a time period where Louis XIV thought he was going to be able to connect his kingdom with that of Spain's because his grandson had been promised the Spanish throne. So he tried to join those together. But in doing so, they were kind of threatening the balance of power in Europe. And so these two great kingdoms, Spain and France, were about to come together. Well, everybody else knew that was a problem. And so the English, the Italians, Portugal, the Dutch Republic, Austria, all of these people joined together to fight them. And so from 1701 to 1714, they fought this war, and this long war dragged on for many years. And eventually, they allowed the grandson to remain on the throne of Spain, but they could not join together. They were not united. The big winner of this was Great Britain, and the loser was France, who lost some possessions and was not able to unite his kingdom. And this would basically end his reign. So what's his legacy? Well, his legacy is that he made France into a military power. They become a very huge fighting force during this time. They have a lot of power. They rarely lose wars, and even so, they don't lose much when they do. He also made France the major cultural center of the world. Everyone wanted to be like France during this time. On the positive side, it was a force to be reckoned with. In arts, literature, and statesmanship, they were unmatched throughout the world. They were considered the military leader. They had strong colonies and plenty of resources from trade, but the constant warfare and major debts left from it, that and the palace, caused massive problems for France in the future. You can see in the graphic to the right, very much they had debt before him in 1643, and then even when he finally takes over in 1661, they had a lot of debt. He actually lowers it for a couple of years, but then doubles it, and then doubles it again by the end of his reign in 1715. So he had a mixed review, and it's not better summed up than by the reaction to his death. In 1715, when he died, news of his death prompted rejoicing throughout France because the people had just had enough of the Sun King. And so those are three more examples of absolute monarchs during this time. And again, just trying to show you examples of what these people look like so that we can see the effects of them later on. Your exit ticket for the day is that each of these, absolute monarchs had a glorification process where they glorified their own reign through something. Louis XIV, for instance, built the Palace of Versailles to glorify his power and his reign. So What would you build to glorify yourself if you were an absolute monarch? Draw a picture of this magnificent building project. So tell me what you're building. You could build a massive palace, castle, modern times ideas, whatever glorifies your reign. You know, if you're an athlete, you might want to build something like the best baseball field ever. I don't know. But what glorifies you? It could be a statue. What would you build to glorify yourself? And draw it best you can. I'm not going to judge your drawings. And then tell me what it is and draw it. And if you color it, I'll give you some extra points. If it's more detailed, I'll give you some extra points on your next test. Okay? So, again, what would you glorify? Tell me what it is. And then draw that thing best you can. Okay? And then we'll have that turned in by the end of the week. Okay? If you didn't get your notes, this is a good way to get them all. And we'll talk more about Absolute Monarchs tomorrow. So I hope you have a great day.